Hello everyone, this is Josh, the developer of Huddle Genius, back with another video. Today we're going to be visiting the Insights section. This is recorded on version 1.01c of Huddle Genius. 1.01c added a couple key factors that were missing. The first thing is that when you hover over a player in the draft room, you will end up seeing the shared exposures, which is very useful. It shows which players are hidden. So for instance, if you're hovering over Justin Jefferson in the first round, it'll already show you which players you will not see in the future. Very useful for playing around with your exposure settings and also the shared exposure preferences. The other thing that we added was the uniqueness score and the uniqueness report. What this is, it basically shows you the score of a team based upon how unique it is compared to your other exposures. So basically, the lowest exposed team you have would be the most unique, whereas the highest exposed team would have the least unique. And that exposure is graded similar to a high school report card where it goes from A+ to F, F being your most common type of roster with your most exposed players, whereas an A+ would be arguably your weirdest team. So we're going to go ahead here and going to the Insights section. Firstly, we are going to the planning section. The planning section, by the way, is the only section here that has nothing to do with our exposures. This is purely, as the name implies, planning. On this list is the starting quarterback list. The starting quarterbacks is basically what Huddle Genius considers valid quarterback targets when you click a new draft and we set up a draft. So if a quarterback is not on this list, they will not be considered a starting quarterback and therefore not selected as a quarterback pick. Now, right now, I know there are a couple teams where the starting quarterback is not obvious. The first one at the time of this recording is the Colts with Anthony Richardson and Shedeur Sanders down here for Cleveland. Russell Wilson, it sounds like, has earned that starting job. I'm not thinking otherwise, but with these two, there is definitely something to be said there about, if you want to take the risk on picking either of them. And now why both of these are on this list is by default, Huddle Genius considers the highest ADP to be the starter. So, or I'm sorry, the lowest ADP, I should say, the first pick. So Anthony Richardson is picked before Daniel Jones. Shedeur Sanders is picked before any other Cleveland quarterback, and that is why. If you do choose that you think a different quarterback is starting for that team, you can mark them in the player manager. If we wanted Daniel Jones to be here instead, we could just set him as the starting quarterback and Anthony Richardson would go away. Same thing down here with Cleveland. If you want Joe Flacco or you want somebody else, you can do that. You can also skip all of them and it'll still show up the starting quarterbacks here, but they will not be picked. If for some reason they are eliminated for a different reason, there are a lot of settings that you can do to enable or disable quarterbacks after a certain ADP also. Like if we just said, hey, we don't want a quarterback over ADP 200 to ever be suggested, we could also do that. Now we're going to back out of this. We are now going to move to the analysis, and now we are going to be looking at our drafted teams. We currently have 64 drafted teams on this account. So the drafted team list is a general overview of the teams that we have picked. On the left side, we see the quarterbacks. For Huddle Genius, quarterbacks are a large part of how we view teams and how we think about teams, because with the quarterbacks comes implied stacking. It also tends to also form our matchups depending on our matchup settings. This list is not ordered in any way. Currently, it is just, basically your list of teams. So here on the middle, you got the top team exposure. This is a list of the teams on that drafted team that are the most exposed. So here you can see Tampa Bay, Las Vegas, Washington, and Cleveland. And that is the case that we have at least 2 players for all of those. Well, a team will not show up on here if it is not picked at least twice. So even though obviously there are other teams other than the Chargers and Bengals here, it is only showing those 2 because they are the only 2 teams that have at least 2 players picked. The strategy over here is very interesting. The strategy is the identified strategy that we have with this team. So, for instance, this one right here, EQB, Elite Quarterback. 1 or more quarterbacks picked before round 4. So that was Lamar Jackson picked here. And you can see some of them have multiple strategies listed. Like, look at this one. This has three different strategies we have identified: modified 0 RB, the bulldozer wide receiver, and the elite quarterback. 3 different things here. So you can look through all your teams and, you know, see the different strategies. Now, there are other areas that the strategies are also listed, and I'm going to show you those in the future. But yeah, this is a very interesting section. And again, you can hover over any team and see exactly who you have on that roster. Very, very useful. As well as the exposures for each of those players. All there at a glance. We're going to back out of here and move on to the next section. The bye week vulnerabilities. So here we have which weeks we're not going to have players playing. So by this graph right here, 18% of our players will not be playing in week 8, whereas 7.5% will not be playing in week 7. Obviously, that's a good thing. You want your players playing, but you know, everybody's got a bye week. There's not much you can do about that. But what makes this very interesting also is down at the bottom here, you can filter it to rounds. So let's say we just want to know our bye week vulnerabilities for our players picked in the first round. We click that once, and there we are. Now, in this scenario, I'm assuming that week 8 is probably the bye week of the Lions. I think the Lions, you know, they got a couple players that go in the first round, so it's a very good guess that they are week 8. And any other player that might be in the first round that's week 8 would be my guess. And this week 5 would probably be somebody that I don't normally pick in the first round who happened to be there. I think I did pick Trey McBride once in the first round, which probably is that team, or, you know, Brock Bowers, somebody that I picked really early. And, you know, if you're, depending on what you're picking too, like if you're the 12th pick, it kind of like blurs that line in between round 1 and 2. You know, when you're there at the turn, you kind of just pick 2 guys. It doesn't necessarily split in a weird way. And here's another cool thing you can do here too. You can set a minimum and maximum. So let's left click here. And as you can see, all these are highlighted. So this is all information for the first 6 rounds. So in the first 6 rounds, week 8, 24%, 24.7% have a bye week. So you can do that any other way. You can right click it and also set a minimum. So if we right click this, this means any player picked after the 6th round, this is the exposures as far as the bye weeks go. So this whole section is all about identifying where your bye weeks are. Just very broad information. You could probably expect to see your teams kind of go down. You know, like in my situation, week 8 would be a rough week for my teams. Like I could expect to see, you know, a downturn that week. Whereas, you know, week 6 would probably be an upturn. Just kind of a very, very general way to view your teams, right? All right, we're going to back out here and go to the percentage of draft strategy. This section is basically a breakdown of all the strategies that were identified on every single team you did. So in my case, this is 64 teams identified and analyzed. And then we go through and we break down which strategies were identified on those teams. We can also hover over a icon to get a description of what that is. So for instance, 3.8% of our teams use the RB hero strategy. That is 1 running back in rounds 1 or 2 and no other running back until round 7. Very specific. And a lot of these are very specific. You know, the bully tight end, 2 or more tight ends in the first 5 rounds. The punt tight end, no tight end until round 13 or later. Another very interesting thing about this is that a team can have multiple characteristics, very similar to what we saw earlier in the draft list. That is basically that data put into one table that you can see at a glance. Unclassified means that it has no strategy that is identified above. So these teams, these 18.8% of teams, they just don't have a defining characteristic. That is usually a team that is drafted fairly balanced, nothing crazy, nothing weird. Probably the only thing that would be tagged normally on a balanced team could be that elite QB, which I don't think is necessarily crazy. But it, you know, it kind of eliminates that. So it means we just don't have a, you know, we don't have a quarterback in the first 5 rounds and then no other identifying characteristic that lined up. You know, we picked our first quarterback before round 12. You know, we picked our first tight end before 13 and so on. All right, we are now going to back out this. We are now going to the top teammate pairings. Now, what this is basically your most picked combination of players with a quarterback and a skilled position. So we have Justin Fields and Breece Hall is actually our most paired teammates right now. You got Patrick Mahomes, Hollywood Brown afterwards, and so on and so forth. This is just kind of identifying, who is going to be your guys, what is it going to be. Doesn't necessarily mean that this is your highest exposed players, but is your highest exposed pairing of players, if that makes sense. By the way, in any of these sections, you can click the help button, and it does pop up a little help blurb about, what the section is. All right, we are now going to get out of this, and we are going to head back to the menu here and head over to the drafting habits. So the drafting habits basically explains which pattern you are picking the most of. This is if you are picking the same player followed by another player over and over. So in 4.7% of my teams, I have Jacoby Myers followed by Tony Pollard. And that's it. That's really all this is. It's basically just saying that these two players are together and picked, after each other. If we increase the pattern size, we actually increase looking for a larger pattern. There's only one here, and that is Odunze Montgomery and Josh Downs. We picked that twice in a row. If a team, if any pattern is only picked once, it wouldn't show here, obviously, because then, every single thing would be on this list. And we do not have anything in 4 or 5, but, it'd be interesting if you could pick the same thing twice in a row, 5 times in a row. But, you could always try it if you want to achieve that. All right, we are now going to back out of the drafting habits and go to the unique teams. This is what I discussed earlier about what was added in 1.01c. So these are our most unique teams based upon the exposures on those teams compared to our other teams. So everything here is scaled. There will always be an F and there will always be an A+. It doesn't mean a team is good. It doesn't mean a team is bad. You can't avoid getting an F and you cannot avoid getting an A+ because we're scaling it. So our A+ team here, you can hover over. This actually works very, very similarly to the drafted teams table. In fact, it is nearly identical besides this unique score column. You can hover over the team and see the percentages. And unlike the drafted team list, this actually does have it ordered by the unique score. You can also skip pages here, look at different pages. And here down here, we can see our least unique teams, the teams that have a lot of players in common. So here you go. And you can hover over and kind of find out why too. Like if you're looking at this, you can kind of see like, oh yeah, there's a lot of players that are over 10%, which again, these are scaled. So for me, my highest allowed exposure is 12.5. So if you're somebody that's doing this by hand, maybe this doesn't seem that high of exposure, but I only allow 12.5. So since everything is scaled, yeah, a lot of these are all like, look at the lowest exposure in it, 6.2. There's no wonder this is getting an F. That, again, that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just implying that, hey, this is not a very unique team compared to what I've already picked. And as you do drafts, these scores will change because it's always, if you add a new team, everything gets shifted around. That's what makes it interesting. You can revisit this and see how things go. And by the way, when you're drafting live, it will show the unique score for the team you're drafting every single pick, and it'll show if it goes up or down. And again, I keep emphasizing it, but that does not mean the team is good or bad. It just is just for your information, just for fun. All right, we're going to back out of this. We have finished the analysis. We are going to go to the exposure. The exposure currently has 5 different sections. We're going to go ahead and visit each one. The player exposure is very straightforward. It is a list of your players by exposure, sorted by exposure. Huddle Genius here doing a very good job keeping us under our exposure of 12.5%. Look at this. 12.5% is our highest. That is why I love this program. It keeps us from going over that. And you can set whatever you want. If you want your exposure to be 100%, you can do that. If you want it to be 1%, you wouldn't want to do that because the program would probably loop. But, you can set your exposures however you want. This one I don't have much more to say about. Fairly straightforward about how it works. We're going to back out here. We are now going down to the composition exposure. This one is a single page, and how this table works is that it is a breakdown of how your teams are constructed. So 12.5% of my teams, boy, we love that number. 12.5% of my teams have 2 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 7 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. So this one's very straightforward again. It's basically just telling you how your teams are broken down. Very straightforward, I would say. All right, we're going to go ahead and back out of this one. And now we are going to the positional tier insight. This one basically just shows your exposure based upon the tiers of each position. So 40% of my quarterbacks, well, let's say 39.5%, are a tier 4 quarterback. 15.4% are tier 1 quarterback. And these exposures are limited to just that position. So obviously it doesn't mean 40% of my players are tier 4 quarterback. That would be absurd. But basically just that position we have highlighted. And we can change that position down here at the bottom: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Very interesting. So we're now going to go ahead and back out of this one. We are now going to move over to the team exposure. The team exposure, in my opinion, also is a very, very interesting tool. It shows your exposures to each team. This one is even color coded. You got your greens and your reds, and everything here is on one nice screen. So as far as why a color is green, it means that basically we are picking that double what the average would be. The average being 1 in 32. There are 32 NFL teams. So 1 out of 32 would be, hey, every single player I pick is going to be balanced with how many teams there are. So if we're at like 4%, we're saying that we at least go double the average of, that specific team. Whereas the red color would be the opposite. We have less than that average. Again, not a good or bad thing. It's just for your information. There's no right or wrong answer here. Using Huddle Genius, everything here is fairly balanced. If you were somebody that did a bunch of teams by hand and imported them into the program, it'd be very interesting to see how that would work. Down at the bottom, here is that thing where you can set the rounds, minimum and maximum, based upon what you want to see. So if we just want to see our exposure to teams from first round picks, we click on the first round here and look at this. This is our exposure to the first round. No surprise here, I would say, either. The Lions, 14.1%. There are 2 Lions in that first round. 9.4% here for the Cowboys. 7.8% for the Bengals. 7.8% for the Ravens, and so on. You can kind of give an idea of, what I'm picking. A lot of it's fairly obvious, like what I'm picking in the first round. Eagles is probably Saquon. Giants is probably Neighbors. Dolphins is, of course, Achan. So it just kind of gives you an idea. So yeah, that's kind of how that works. And down here at the bottom, you can also set a range. So let's say we click this. This would be the first 6 rounds. Like we click 6. So this is our exposure to teams for the first, on Underdog, this would be the first third of the draft. So we're going to be sinking a lot of our ADP capital. No surprise to see teams here that just don't have players in that range, like the Patriots, 0.3%. We're just not picking Patriots. There are no Patriots really to pick in the first 6 rounds. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just letting you know for your information. All right, we're now going to back out of this. And we are going to head to the last section here in the exposure section. This one here is a combination of kind of what we were just looking at combined with looking at the NFL schedule. So what we're looking at here is how important games in the season are. So week 14, we got the Steelers Ravens, 8.3%. So what that is saying in plain English is 8.3% of our exposed players will be playing each other in the Ravens and Steelers game in week 14. It really is just that simple. I'm gonna go ahead and scroll over here. And yeah, as you can see, it just kind of goes on and on. But yeah, very, very interesting table here to look at. We are now going to go ahead and back out. Oh, before I do that, though, again, down here at the bottom, you can set the rounds. So if you just want to look at the first round, you click that. And there you go. Like, these are our first round picks and where they're going to be playing and which games are the most important to us. Cowboys, Lions, Giants, Lions, Lions, Ravens, Lions, Bengals. No surprise to see the lines here. Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra. Those are 2 lines that we're picking, and, you know, they are in the first round. So no surprise there. And again, you can go, let's say we click on the 6th round. These would be our players that we picked in the first third of the draft in Underdog Best Ball, and their exposures. Again, lines still sticking around. There's plenty of lines. You got, by, you know, adding this, we also added in Jameson Williams, so we're not really dropping lines. That's another player that's probably getting picked by us. So yeah, and you got a Bengal one up here, which makes sense. You know, you got T. Higgins, you got Jamar Chase, you got Chase Brown. Absolutely makes sense to see that there. Finally, we are going to go over to the visuals section. Currently, there is only 1 report in the visual section. I'm going to click that right now. So the visual section is 1 screen, and what it's showing is where you sunk the most ADP into a team. You could kind of figure this out on your own using the other tool, the drafted teams, and the, you know, your exposures to matchups, your exposures to teams, especially if you start like looking at the rounds. But basically, this is a visual representation. How this one works mathematically is basically your first round pick is worth 2 of your second round pick, your second round pick is worth 2 of your third round pick, and so on. So the teams that pick players early on will, or, you know, the teams that you draft that contain players from these teams early on will have the bigger bubbles. So the Detroit Lions there has the biggest bubble. We kind of identified that earlier, that we have a lot of Lions exposure in that first round. So no surprise to see their big bubble there floating around. Bengals also on there, the Ravens, the Rams. Now the Raiders there, you got Genty and Bowers. That's why we're seeing that. Vikings would probably be a little bigger, but we're a little underexposed to Justin Jefferson. I think they're kind of being propped up right now, probably by a lot of Addison and Aaron Jones. But basically, you get an idea looking at this, what it's supposed to mean, what it actually means. Some bubbles are very little, like Carolina and New England, very little. It doesn't necessarily mean that our exposures to those teams, this is not representative of your actual exposures. It's representative to how much you're putting into these teams as far as your picks. So it doesn't necessarily mean like, hey, I got no Titans because the Titans bubble's really small. It definitely doesn't mean that. It's just more of, hey, I picked these players early. It doesn't mean I'm doing something weird. Everybody else is likely doing the same thing anyway. So that is it for the Insights section as of 1.01c. I'm going to back out of this really quickly, and I would like to go to the Players section. May as well. It's definitely something that is very relevant to Huddle Genius. So the Players section is a graphical user interface that lets you manage the players that Huddle Genius uses and assign characteristics to those. When I originally released Huddle Genius, well, not released it, but was working on it, I had everything in text files, and I don't think that's fun. What I like to do is I like to see something on my screen and be able to easily manage it. So that is what we got here with the Player Manager. We can manage our players right here in front of us and assign characteristics to them. I'm not going to go through every single page of this, but I at least would like to explain how it works. Down here, you have assigned player characteristics. If you hover over these, you can see what the characteristic means. For instance, rushing quarterback, if you put this on a quarterback, it makes it so the quarterback will not pick soft targets. So if you assigned, hypothetically, let me get out of this. Hypothetically, let's say if we put Josh Allen as a rushing quarterback. See, there it is right there. Hypothetically, if we had this, it would make it so if Josh Allen was our quarterback target, it would not pick soft targets with him. So it's totally up to you if you want to do this. It doesn't change how often a quarterback is picked or not. All it does is it just completely ignores wide receivers for that team. I don't necessarily think this is a right or wrong choice. That is a choice for you to make yourself. Going down here also, we have the receiving running backs. What this does is it sets a running back as a receiver basically for soft target purposes. So what could happen is you could, if you set, let's say we went over and set Bijan Robinson as a receiving running back, which I currently have. When we're setting soft targets for, if we ended up picking Michael Penix, we could have Bijan Robinson set as a soft target for that team, based on our team planning. Another thing you can set is the skip player. What that does is it basically skips a player just like the name implies. Look, let's click it on him. Skip. And look, his color turned red there. That's because we did that. Let me remove it. So if you skip a player, more or less you're telling the program that you do not want them picked. By the way, if you see a red number here, it means that we're not picking that player currently. There's a lot of reasons why that could be. In this case, it's because he's at 12.5%. In these players' cases, it's because of the blocking setting I have. It is also possible that the player has 0 projected points. That also could, cause a player not to be in it, depending on where you're importing from. Here is that starting quarterback thing that I talked about before. If you believe that you know who is starting on a team, you can click this. And I was just talking about this earlier. Shedeur Sanders, Kenny Pickett, and Flacco. Right now, Sanders and Flacco are tied. But let's say I believe Flacco is the starter. I think he is. I'm going to click that. Right click, get this off. And there. Now, in the future, if we're setting a starting quarterback for the Browns, it'll use Joe Flacco. Faded player basically tells the program you only want half the amount of the exposure we allow. So in my case, I allow 12.5%. That would put it at 6.25%. For instance, I have Quinshon Judkins is a faded player. He's at 6.25. That is why he is red. Otherwise, if I remove this, watch this. I'll remove it. Look, now I can pick him again. I don't want him. I'm going to put that back. But you get what I'm saying. Basically, if you do not want a player to show up, you put the faded player characteristic on. Next, we got the favored player. The favored player works the exact opposite way. It is saying we will allow twice as much exposure. So if we wanted 25% instead of 12.5%, click this and put it on somebody. Jerry Jeudy, we want more of them? There you go. There, now he's no longer blocked. Of course, we're going to remove that, but that is something you can do. Last but not least, we have the emerging player. The emerging player tells the program that you want that player picked regardless of your blocking setting and the preferences. By default, I only allow the first tight end on each team to be displayed and picked. But there are teams where you may want 2 tight ends. A perfect example is Isaiah Likely. Isaiah Likely right here. I'm going to go ahead and put him as an emerging player. And there you go, 4.69, and he's white. That means that we can pick him again. And that's kind of a rare situation. There's not a lot of teams where you want more than the first tight end based on ADP. But by allowing this, you can do that. Let's go to the Chiefs. That's another one that I would consider with Noah Gray. Let's allow Noah Gray. I think Noah Gray should be allowed as a tight end. There you go. Now, this type of mechanic does require you to know a bit about football and understanding, which teams might have that second tight end pick or maybe that second running back pick if you do block the second running back. Currently, I do not. Currently, I allow the first 3 running backs on a team and the first 4 wide receivers and the first tight end. But you can change that to however you want. If you want it so only the first 2 running backs show up, you can do that very easily. So that is it for the player section. I'm not really sure if there's anything else that I probably need to show. I think that kind of sums it up. Up here at the top, of course, you can click between the teams. If that is not obvious, you can go back to the all section. And yeah, that is it for the player manager. I think that kind of sums up everything I wanted to show here with the Insights and Player Manager. Again, this was recorded on 1.01c. There is always going to be more updates coming to Huddle Genius throughout this season, particularly leading up to the start of the best ball season. So stay tuned and good luck out there, guys.